Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today called Politics and Faith in a Polarized World. I'd like to thank our political leaders for conveniently scheduling a federal election just in time for our webinar. My name is Joseph Sinisak. I'm Publishing Director of Novalis Publishing. This afternoon's webinar was prompted actually by the publication of our latest book of the same name by John Milloy, who joins us this afternoon with Catherine Mulroney. We think the timing is right for this particular discussion, not just because we're in the midst of an election campaign, but also because in recent years we have seen an increasing polarization in society over many issues, not least of which is the role of religion in politics. In fact, brave indeed is the Canadian politician who admits that faith is a serious matter to him or her. They immediately become a target for every sort of attack based on ignorance, misinformation, or fear. John Milloy tackles this issue straight on in his new book with an argument based on both practical experience and long reflection on how to live out his own Roman Catholic faith in an authentic way, while also at the same time working effectively with those who hold widely diverging beliefs. Today, we are going to explore the many facets of this issue in a conversation that I expect to be very lively indeed between John and author-journalist Catherine Mulroney. And by the way, Catherine is joining us by audio feed today. So welcome to the both of you. Many of you, especially if you're from Ontario, you will know or have heard of John Milloy. He's a former member of provincial parliament, former Ontario cabinet minister, who in his earlier career also served in the Prime Minister's office under Jean Chrétien. Today, he is director of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo. Catherine is a Toronto author and journalist, former editor of Living with Christ. She's also a very keen observer of both the political scene and the Catholic Church. So now we know each other, and over to you, Catherine.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm sorry that I'm off camera, but technology sometimes gets the better of us. I'd like to start by offering John congratulations on this timely book, and particularly for his subtitle, A Challenge for Catholics, because the book is very much about what we as Catholics can do to better engage in the world. But I'd like to start by asking you, John, we're talking about politics and faith in a polarized world. Why did you write this book now? What spoke to you?
Well, thank you for the question, Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Novalis for hosting this event and Catherine for being the moderator. It's a great question. Why did I write this book? I wrote this book because I was frustrated. I look around at our world right now, particularly what's happening here in Canada. We're facing so many problems, so many challenges. I think we would all agree that COVID-19 has laid bare, I think, a lot of sins and problems here in Canada. And we need to have a very, very important national conversation. And we need all sorts of voices. And some of the voices that I think we need are people of faith, and the Catholic community is one of them. We have hundreds and hundreds of years of Catholic social teaching, of the wisdom that we could bring to this conversation. And instead, we increasingly, I think, are being locked out of it. The book, I guess the inspiration for the book came about in 2019, when we had a Conservative Party leader who was a devout Catholic, who, quite frankly, I don't think knew how to explain the role that faith played in his life. And at the same time, we had the chattering classes, the pundits, the panelists on TV news, and the journalists who didn't really understand the role that faith could play. And it became a punchline. And Catholicism, I think, more and more has been reduced to your stand on abortion, beginning and end, and we've forgotten the richness of it and the way that it can contribute to the conversation. I think we need to have those voices there, not somehow dominant, not somehow, we're God's spokespeople, let us through, but in terms of being thoughtful, in terms of adding to it. And I think it's a call to Catholics to take their place, and it's a call to society to recognize and respect the fact that we might have something to say.
even though we were in the midst of a pandemic when this election was called, I found it very surprising because in the weeks and months leading up to the call, the Catholic Church was on the front of newspapers across this country virtually every day. The topic was residential schools, and it was convenient for politicians, modern politicians, to weigh in on the story and pillory the church. And they were stories filled with emotion. Every Catholic I know was talking about this subject. And then the way the campaign has gone thus far, that topic is on the sidelines. Abortion is on the sidelines. All the other things we should be talking about are on the sidelines as we're at each other's throats on the subject of personal rights and collective rights and what we owe to each other because we live in community. And even questions of how we speak to each other. What is civil? What is decency? How do we recognize the dignity of others? And I would argue that these are extraordinarily Catholic topics. And this may be an opportunity for us to demonstrate what we can bring to the electoral process and public discourse as a whole. Would you agree?
Oh, I'd agree 100%. I mean, when I talk about what Catholicism can bring to the public square, I'm not simply talking about the issues, although they're very, very important, but it's also how we conduct them. I mean, I think those of us or those who've had the time to read Fratelli Tutti it's an amazing, amazing encyclical. And one of its themes is really about dialogue and about sort of reaching across the aisle, about building bridges. Yes, there are times, and I point this out in the book, I acknowledge there are times when you have to call out the other side. It's absolutely wrong what they're saying. It's evil. We can't in any way tolerate it, but my gosh, those are few and far between. For the most part, we have to find a way to live with each other. We have to find a way to build a common life together. Pope Francis speaks about, everyone's share of the truth. And I think Catholics have a real call. I mean, the founder of our church was a man who said, turn the other cheek, who said, love your enemy. I mean, the message from Christ is one of building bridges and of tolerance and humility and sort of, approaching the other side with an openness. And you see that throughout the church's teachings. We don't hear about that in the popular media. As I say, it usually begins and ends with abortion and maybe a sort of a charge of homophobia thrown in. But the fact is, we have a rich tradition of engaging with others. And if there's two things that have come out of this campaign. One is it has become, and I'm not the first to say it, a bit of a Seinfeld election about nothing, despite the fact that we have all these unbelievably huge issues facing our society. But the other is just the lack of civility. I mean, to the point where we're looking at violence is taking place. And I think there's a role for Catholic voices in addressing both of them.
You cite American theologian Kathleen Kavanaugh a few times in the book, especially when she talks about people in the church who believe in a culture of community and engagement versus those Catholics who see themselves engaged in a culture of identity. What are the differences and what do they mean to the church and to political discourse?
Well, I mean, I'm a huge fan. Those people who are watching, an American author and theologian, a legal scholar. I mean, she's thought a lot about this, and unfortunately, I don't know if she's ever looked at the Canadian context, but there are some lessons from what's happening in the United States. And she goes back to Vatican II and that spirit of engagement, where Catholics would go out and see where they could make common cause with the world. And, I don't think you have to go far. I mean, you think of the environment, think of efforts to end poverty, think of so many racism, think of so many of the issues that are right now top of the agenda, which align with Catholic teaching, with Catholic social teaching. And there is that opportunity to find common ground. But as she argues, and I think quite persuasively, we saw a shift, in the early 80s and 90s, where all of a sudden Catholics started to think about the world and the differences they had with the world. that did coincide with some of the hot button issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, that sort of thing. And what you saw is a lot of the Catholic community turning inwards, very angry with the world, very critical of the world, and not willing to engage it. That I think is first of all, it's not helping the church. I think it's Pope Francis has spoken very eloquently about we need to get out there and get involved and smell like sheep, as he said, and be a battlefield. But the other thing is it's robbing society of some very, very important voices and some very, very important messages. And, it frustrates me. And unfortunately, as an ex-politician, I always think, well, how does this look politically? Well, we're playing into the hands of those who want to caricature Catholics or people in faith in general as sort of these crazy zealots who, they're obsessed with abortion and sex. And my gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we never had to hear from them? I mean, it plays into it, this idea of identity. I was reading something by Richard Rohr the other day that, it made me laugh, or maybe it said that a lot of us sit around trying to tell God who he should and should not love. And that's our call of faith. Well, that's not the call of Catholicism. We've got to get out there and be part of this world, engage with this world. And I think there's an opportunity here.
You're quite frank in the book on some of the hot button issues. That Catholics are swimming upstream when we talk about abortion or many of the most contentious issues in the country today. So for a Catholic politician to focus exclusively on those issues means he or she is going to be shut out of the public square because the vast voting majority disagree. Could you talk a little bit about the consistent ethic of life and how that makes a difference for the Catholic politician in terms of addressing multiple issues that are all interlinked and can touch on these key issues?
Sure. Hopefully in the book, I try to unpack some of these issues. We have church teaching, and as Catholics, we try to follow the church teaching. As it relates to us as individuals, the individual decisions that we're going to make, the way we might deal if we're, counseling a friend or involved in a personal situation. But there's another facet to this, and that is as a matter of public policy. And I think there's a practicality within a lot of the church's teaching, which says you meet the world where it is. And, I spend some time on some of the examples from theology, going back to Aquinas, where people say, look, you've got to sort of respect what's going on in society. You've got to understand where people's heads are at. On many of these issues, we run immediately to a law. We need a law. We'll ban this or ban that. Well, right now in Canada, the idea of an abortion law is not going to happen. Not a single major federal party wants anything to do with it. In fact, they're all falling over each other to say that it's never going to happen. But that doesn't mean that a Catholic politician can't be concerned about life. And in fact, I say in the book, I think there is something when people criticize, some of the more extreme pro-life elements, that they're not pro-life, they're pro-birth. I mean, what happens after that child is born? What happens to the woman that's in crisis? So what if we stopped worrying about a law that's not going to happen? And as I point out in the book, I'm not even sure what it's going to look like. But what if we stopped worrying about that and instead started to be a little bit more consistent in respecting life at all stages? There is common ground between the pro-life and the pro-choice movement. It's the woman involved, a woman in crisis. How is that woman being supported? What about issues around, childcare? What about issues around that woman's future? Will the birth of that baby mean that she has to drop out of school? She won't be able to pursue a career, that her life is quote unquote over? I mean, what about putting energy into creating a society where life at the early stages is supported, then life all the way to 18 is supported, that we respect life all the way around? We worry about the environment, we worry about poverty, And then at the end of life, we have proper palliative care and a proper medical system that can care for people. That's a lot of work. And that's quite an agenda. And that's one that I think Catholics could embrace as part of their faith. And it's not simply, oh yeah, everyone's in favor of that. That would entail some sacrifices. That would entail policy decisions that would be very, very tough. But all of a sudden, it's a platform that you can use to have dialogue with the wider community, where, to go back to the question about Kathleen Caveney, where you can find a way to engage with the world. And, I'm not certainly the first to ever speak of this. Joseph Bernardin, the famous, he was a cardinal in the United States, famous Catholic speaker, Catholic thinker. He spoke about a consistent ethic of life and how important it is for Catholics to think about it across the board, to not just focus on this little piece of it and a law which is not going to happen.
That speaks to my next question, which is where the person not in politics, the Catholic not in politics, fits in. When we talk about the intersection of the Catholic Church and politics, we tend to think of the politician, Joe Biden with his rosary beads, or Jack Kennedy, and was he going to be told by the Vatican what to do? But it means we're all engaged. And what do Catholics need to do to make the most of this privilege, this right? How do we educate ourselves, particularly in a time of misinformation, questionable social media? It can be very hard to learn in this complicated world that we live in.
Definitely. Yeah, there's nothing easy about, the call of getting involved and engaging with the world. It begins with education about the Catholic faith, and not only Catholic social teaching, which is so important. And, I've had a few people point out to me, you can't pigeonhole. You read part of it and you think, wow, the Catholic Church is a lefty organization. Then you read the next part and you think, wow, we're right wing. And then you read the next part and we're middle of the road. No, Catholic social teaching is quite amazing that way. It's a way of understanding and viewing the world, which does challenge conventional wisdom on what's going on. So I think Catholics need to start to understand Catholic social teaching. They need to understand some of these nuances I was mentioning earlier about, how it translates into public policy and how you deal with the political system. Then I think they also have to, and this is tough, they also have to start thinking about how we treat each other, how we listen to each other, the fact that we don't write off a huge swaths of the population as baskets of deplorables, and my apologies to Hillary Clinton. That we don't go into an election campaign with the idea that I hope my party wins, so that not because I want them to win and put forward a policy agenda, but because I want them to win to just smash the other side and to make sure that the other side has no voice. No, we need to go in with open minds. We need to go in to build bridges, to engage. They're very, very tough things. And then on a very practical level, I think we need to increase political literacy in Canada. We need to try to dig down a bit on, what's happening right now, for example, in terms of the campaign. I think there is a role for parishes, for organizations, faith-based organizations, to sponsor discussions and dialogue, and both to inform people and to inspire people. I point out in the book that politics, there's an old joke where the bishop, I don't know why it's a bishop, but I guess bishops are always part of the joke. The bishop asks the politician, what's the politician's stand on crime? And the politician says he's against it. And, right now we're in the middle of an election campaign where everyone's against everything that's bad and everyone's in favor of everything that's good. Well, that's not reality. Reality is there are tough choices. There are priorities that need to be made. Need to be taken. There's trade-offs, all that sort of thing. And I think that an informed electorate that's inspired by things like Catholic social teaching and a willingness to build bridges can actually engage politicians and hold them to account and say, all right, what is going to be your priority? How are you going to organize things to address some of these very, very important issues? Because those very important issues sometimes make great sound bites, but when it comes to putting together a budget, they're not going to get you any votes. So all of a sudden, Indigenous reconciliation gets set aside, care for seniors gets set aside, a whole host of very, very important issues get set aside because the voters, they like talking about it, but they don't want their tax dollars to go there.
You note in the book that close to 40% of Canadians identify as Catholics. We are a big voting bloc in theory. What role does the institutional church have to play, if any, in this? And what role does the institutional church have in educating us? Where does it start and where does it stop?
That's a tricky question, obviously, because I respect the fact that, on the one hand, that Canada's bishops have in many cases taken a step back and, certainly stayed out of the firing line. You don't always see that to the south. And, the church recognizes there are different ways to get to the same end, and that it's okay that I may be, I was a Liberal politician and another Catholic is an NDP or a Conservative politician. So you don't want our leadership taking sides or flirting with partisanship. But at the same time, there is a very, very proud history in this country of Canada's Catholic bishops taking a stand on social issues, asking people to really sacrifice for the common good, to get involved in a whole range of issues from workers' rights to the economy. In 1983, I'm sure there's people watching this. The bishop's statement on the economy made international news, holding then the Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. to account on what was happening in the system. There used to be a tradition that on Labor Day, of course, just a few days ago, the Canada's Catholic bishops would put out statements on social justice issues, on very, very important policy issues. And that stopped. I believe the Labor Day statement stopped in 1976. And I actually quote from it in their final one in my book. And it's got language in it about Catholics needing to really go to the ramparts and demand more justice in our society, a more just society that would be very, very welcome today. And yet we don't hear it anymore. I mean, the odd perfunctory statement is put out, but Canada's Catholic bishops seem so reluctant to call on Catholics to kind of bring that sort of radical side of our faith, to address some of these sins that we've seen. And it's disappointing for me. And I think it's disappointing for other Catholics. And it's not only their leadership, but again, going back to something I said earlier, I would like to see our churches turn more into educational institutions. And yes, they have to be nonpartisan. And I realize there are limits. But all of us, I think, have heard of churches, or we've been aware of a particular parish where there's active committees, where speakers are brought in, where there's debate and discussion, and that can serve to educate and inspire people. If we're an active church and we're engaged on a number of different fronts in terms of social justice issues, I think that adds to our credibility. But instead, as I said, there's at the top, there's been quiet. And the only time we do hear them speak loudly is on some of these hot button issues, which just, again, feeds into the stereotypes and the ability for outsiders to caricature Catholics.
I agree with your notion that it's time for us to go back to the ramparts. But I also want to read a quote from the book to you, in which you say, to be true to our faith, we need to enter the public square, not girded for battle, but ready to learn. What sorts of things do you think Catholic voters and Catholic politicians need to learn or could do better by learning?
I mean, there's no end of issues, but I mean, as a starting point, I think Catholics do fall into the trap. Maybe I should have saved that quote from earlier to use it now, but again, trying to tell God who he should and should not love, as opposed to recognizing that we're all made in the image of God. God loves us all. Yes, there are those moments. There are those moments where what's going on is absolutely evil, but My gosh, I point out in the book, and again, using the fine work of Kathleen Caveney when she speaks about this issue of engaging others and sort of absolute evil, she talks about it in the context of just war theory. Yeah, there are times you have to go to war, and there's times you have to call out evil. But guess what? We don't go to war that often, and there aren't that many things which are totally evil. So that leaves us all in the boat of having to try to understand each other and try to build bridges with each other. And that requires some humility. That requires a recognition that we don't have all the answers. That requires a recognition that I may have a share of the truth, but you also have a share of the truth, and finding a way to work together. And humility is tough. And it's tough sometimes, I think, for Catholics to be humble, because you do sometimes get that. We're a church that unfortunately at times is obsessed with rules, and it's our rules, and our rules are the right way and the only way, and you can't go out and talk to anyone about with a different perspective. But the fact of the matter is, although the church's teachings are steady as she goes, their interpretation, the context, the way we understand them, that changes all the time. I mean, it has to do with the nature of the world that we live in, and you have to meet the world where it is, as I said earlier. So, we don't have all the answers. We're not God's official spokespeople. The other side are equally as loved as God. And I think there are opportunities for us to go out there with some humility and sit down and listen to each other. And let's be honest, that's the only way that we're going to build this society in common. Because I hope that my side gets enough votes in the election on September 20th so that the other side, they can be shut up and put in the corner. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to spend the next 4 years or 2 years, I guess if it's a minority government, trying to get their side to win so that we can go in the corner. And as a Canadian, I get sick of this fact that we have governments that don't, either care a lot of what I want to say or don't care what I want to say, depending on how they're slicing and dicing the electoral pie. So I think we have to think about things differently, and that may require swallowing your pride. What are the areas? Obviously the list is long, but I think the last few years, a renewed emphasis on issues around race, around Indigenous reconciliation, even around poverty. We've started to realize that other people's experiences are not our own. And it's easy to sort of sit back and be critical until you actually start to put yourself in their shoes, until you actually start to realize, in my case, I've been on this planet more than 50 years. I've never had a racial slur against me. I've never had someone discriminate against me because of my race. And yet that's a commonplace experience for many Canadians. Wow, that's something that I've got to process, and that's something with a bit of humility. If I can sit down with racialized individuals, we can start to talk about things like that. And the list goes on. I think the last few years, where all of a sudden we have to be a bit humble and realize that there are other people in our society who are hurting, and we have to listen to them.
Humility was one of the words I circled in the book, especially because you said politicians need to be humble in remembering that upon election, they're not going to fix everything. We're in a broken, challenging world, and there is no quick fix. But the other word that I circled that you used, which really stood out in these challenging times, is a need for gratitude. So what do the electorate need to be grateful for, and what should politicians be grateful for?
A lot.
I agree.
It's strange because it sounds like I'm contradicting myself. And hey, I'm an ex-politician. I'm sure I did it all the time. But I always think the starting point for any of these discussions has to be gratitude, and that may sound strange. The world is broken, and COVID-19 is showing us all these, as I said, sins and problems and all that sort of thing. But if we actually want to make progress and we want to build some of the bridges that I've been speaking about, we have to do it from a foundation, a common foundation which recognizes that there's a lot that's good in our world. There's a lot that we should be thankful for. It is amazing when you start by saying things are good in Canada in some areas. We've experienced a lot that is very positive. We've made progress in certain areas. How can we build on that? How can we replicate some of the positive? That leads to a very different conversation than just simply coming in and saying everything's horrible. Everything's horrible. Everything's not horrible. And when you start with the idea of gratitude, that the world is a good place. We see God. I mean, the world is both redeemed and fallen. So if it's a Catholic book. So from a theological perspective, when you recognize God's redemptive power, and that in turn says, hey, we have some work to do, it creates a very, very different dynamic. And some people out there might be cynical and not believing me, but try it sometime. Try approaching someone, and instead of saying, we have problem X, Y, and Z, say, you know what, we made some progress addressing a particular issue. How can we build on that progress and address issue X, Y, and Z? I guarantee you it will create a very, very different dynamic. And sometimes it's tough. Sometimes the only thing maybe you can point to progress is that we're in the same room talking about something. But, and if we're constantly saying we're never going to get there, everything's bad, everything's worse, I think we're gonna talk ourselves into a very dire situation. And I think that's happening sometimes in Canadian political field, that everyone standing around trying to outdo each other by telling us how many problems we have. And we do have problems, but we also have much to be thankful for.
I admire politicians for taking that deep step into the crowd and developing thick skin and knowing everybody isn't going to be happy at the same time. But I think in many ways it's that much tougher for a Catholic politician, because within the Catholic community, there are going to be those who feel you're not going far enough and those who feel you're going too far. Because we are a fractured community ourselves in some ways, the focus on a Catholic politician has got to be extra tough. What keeps you in the game?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a very good question. I scratch my head sometimes. When you think of the world, and we've talked about it earlier in the discussion, where Catholicism and people of faith and politicians of faith can be the butt of jokes, the sort of punchlines. I think we should all be watching each other's back. I think we should be excited when someone wants to run for office and identify with a particular faith. In this case, the Catholic faith. We should be on their side. We should be supporting them. Maybe at times we should be pushing them a bit to bring a bit more of a pastoral approach of making priorities around some of these key issues, whether we're talking about the environment or poverty or that sort of thing. So it always strikes me as odd that it's almost sort of like, we're going to go after our own. And they certainly went after me as a Catholic politician. I was picketed, and comments were made about my faith and how I certainly wasn't a true Catholic and that sort of thing, which really it seems very, very strange. I think we should be cheering on people of faith when they get into office. Not saying that there aren't people without faith convictions or faith identification that aren't doing an excellent job. But I think that belief in something greater than us, that sense of humility, that call to see God in others, even if the other you can't stand or the other is thousands of miles away. I mean, these are amazing gifts that people bring to public life. And I certainly point out in the book that even on a personal level, for a politician, I think faith can be, can be a bit of a guide, can certainly help them. Because once you get into power, you're just hit from every direction. And it isn't so much that you have to choose between right and wrong. You kind of start to forget what right and wrong are. because right is keeping in power. And there's this, I share in the book, I say that politics in Canada is built on two sort of principles when you're in power, when you are a politician. The first is that you are the only one who can achieve sort of greatness and good stuff for the country. And the second is that the only way to do it is to either keep power or to attain power. And so power becomes the end in itself. And deep down, you tell yourself, yeah, because we're so much better than the other side. And when I shared that once a few months ago with a group, and everyone burst out laughing. And I was surprised by that reaction, because if I gathered a group of politicians from a particular party for a private meeting, they would all agree with me. They'd say, oh, yeah, this is all about me winning, because that's going to be what's best for the country, and I'll do whatever it takes. I mean, that's pretty messed up thinking, and yet it's pretty commonplace. And, I think faith has a way of disrupting all that. And I think on both a personal level and sort of a systemic level.
So does the electorate have the right to know specifics about your internal faith life? Are those fair questions? Is it fair for the electorate to expect to know? I know you noted in the book that the media commented on Jagmeet Singh turban, his turban and his kirpan, but not what those represent, what he's thinking about faith matters. Is it my business that you're a Catholic, a practicing Catholic, at the end of the day?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there are personal aspects. Obviously, there's personal aspects to the faith. There's personal aspects to everyone's life, and it's nobody's business. I think and I hopefully equal opportunity. I criticize everyone. I criticize certainly the media don't really understand faith very well. But I think it's fair to say, how does your faith translate into public policy questions? So in other words, whether, how would you view human rights issues when it comes to the LGBTQ community? I think that's a fair question in terms of human rights, in terms of your role as a legislator. So I think those things are fair game. But the other thing is, I think we should be able to ask our politicians what makes them tick, not to put them on the defensive, but to try to understand them. I would love to understand more about Mr. Singh's faith. And, obviously it is very, very important to him. I mean, the turban, the kirpan, I mean, these are things which many critics point out have been a liability for him. But I think it's fantastic. He said, I don't care. This is important to me. What else is important to him? How does it all fit together? What drives him? What makes him tick? Do I have a right to ask that? Well, of course, I guess I have a right to ask it. I'm not saying that, politicians need to have a polygraph test to do it. But what an amazing conversation that we could have with politicians, asking about what makes them tick. And quite frankly, we might actually start to understand them a little bit better than some of the talking points and the zingers that we're going to see in a few hours.
And that might actually take us to a place where we're not literally throwing stones, which I think is a good thing, given how the campaign has gone. Do you understand the degree of the anger that we're seeing? Is there a place for faith to address that kind of anger going forward?
I mean, I think so. I for people of faith, we've talked about gratitude. We've talked, I would add hope. I would add an understanding of the world. I spoke about how the world is both redeemed and fallen at the same time. Mm-hmm. What that means is that, and I spent a lot of time in the book about utopianism. We live in a world where we're constantly being told by politicians, all we need to do is vote them in and all our problems will be solved. Well, that's not going to happen. We know that intuitively, but actually as Catholics, we should recognize that's against church teaching, that idea of utopianism. And so I think if we're realistic about the world and the fact that it has this fallen nature, if we at the same time have some hope and some thankfulness and little bit of humility, that's going to help how we engage in a political campaign. Hopefully we're not going to be throwing stones. But the other thing is bridge building and trying to understand a little bit about these individuals. And I'm in no way trying to excuse what they're doing, but is there a way to understand their frustration and their fear? And is there a way to engage with them? And is there a way to do it earlier in the process so they're not showing up with literally with stones?
That's why I like the notion of ongoing quasi-political discussions in parishes, seemingly a civilized setting where people can stay abreast of what's happening in the world. And it doesn't all end when Mass ends. I'm still engaged. I'm still thinking. And I'm appropriating my faith because, as you say, we're not just rule followers. We embrace our faith and we have to think about it. We have to inform our conscience and acknowledge that we are a sinful church. And thus we should be able to recognize and quite comfortably engage with the world that we ought to all too often critique.
And I mean, the fact is, it's part of the call.
Yes,
exactly. we can't take a pass on this, folks. As Catholics, it's funny. I'll sort of be on the right side of a few hot button issues, and there I'm a perfect Catholic. Well, no, it's a lot more complicated than that when it comes to politics. And we are called to be engaged. We're called. I remember a priest, a few days before election. He was originally from Ireland. He said, in Ireland, I remember a priest who said it's a mortal sin not to vote. He said, I won't go that far, but I'll tell you, you better get to the ballot box. And it's not just going to the ballot box. It's educating yourself, and it's continuing to be engaged on September the 21st.
What about the challenge of the fact that we live in a pluralistic society, and we can have our ideals and our goals and just butt heads with other people? Is it a question of continued conversation to find that middle ground?
Very much so. And, 2 points. One is continued conversation. And the second, and I try to get into this in the book, there is a difference in terms of Catholic teaching and how it affects us personally, and then how we deal with it in terms of public policy. And I spend some time talking about in the late 60s, the bishops actually made a presentation in front of a parliamentary committee on an effort to legalize contraception. And you know what? The bishops didn't oppose the law, and they walked through sort of the reasons why they didn't oppose the law, even though for their flock, they were asking them not to engage in artificial contraception. So, it's about bridge building, but it's also recognizing there's some nuance here. This isn't about just taking the church's teaching lock, stock, and barrel and somehow trying to impose it, as you say, on a pluralistic society, in a society which is governed by the rules of democracy. This is about engagement. This is about consistency. This is about an approach. And we get so hung up on a few hot button issues, and we get so hung up on rules when it's a lot more than that.
When we look at Joe Biden, he's only the second Catholic president in hundreds of years of history in the United States. We have had many, many Catholic prime ministers. Do you see a difference in the way our countries have evolved?
Oh, definitely. And,
is there any correlation?
Well, I think in some ways, it's nice that in the United States, people can talk about their faith, and it's not as threatening. At the same time, the polarization in the United States frightens me. I do respect the fact that in Canada, people don't wear their faith on their sleeves. And I hope, folks aren't thinking that I somehow want to turn us into the US, where everyone's going to be leading, political rallies in mass prayers the way Ted Cruz does as a senator and that sort of thing. I mean, I think we have to respect the fact that we're a pluralistic society, I think we have to respect the fact that a politician represents everyone. But I think in terms of what makes that politician tick, what are their priorities, where are the lines that they're going to draw to say, I'm not going to cross over it? I think faith can be an ingredient into that. And I don't think we should be terrified of it. In 2019, I'm trying not to make this personal, but I've just found it so frustrating watching Andrew Scheer be pilloried. I was angry at commentators because they didn't really know what they were talking about. But I quite frankly, I was frustrated with Mr. Scheer that he couldn't talk about the value of his faith and the role that it played in shaping him as a politician. So, I don't want to go to the US extreme, but I think we could be a little bit more open in Canada because we're robbing ourselves of some very, very important voices. We had a debate recently about medical assistance in dying. What's at the core of that debate? The core of that debate is does life have meaning even in the face of suffering? And you know what? I actually think the church has a lot to say on that. And it would have been nice if people had been a little bit more open to listening to what the church said, as opposed to everyone getting their back up and it's sort of being, I'm in favor of MAID, I'm against MAID, you're not a good Catholic, you're a bad Catholic, you're going to go to hell, we should excommunicate. I mean, that's not a conversation. That's just name calling.
You talk about the experience in your university classes where you ask students about hot button topics and they see things in a very black and white way. And then you have them unpack it and say, well, if a person is against abortion, do you think they also think X, Y, and Z? Can you think of them as a human being? And it's an interesting exercise to move away from check, check, check in terms of what I think about key matters and really try to understand what the other person is thinking. I see it with my own kids, so I recognized the situation in that chapter. And I think you're so right that we have to get out, get our hands dirty, volunteer, talk, do what I read, do whatever it takes to be engaged as people who bring something invaluable to the ballot box.
And and I think we have to meet the world where it is. And our obsession with laws, or obsession with we're seeing it south of the border. I mean, ultimately, and I have a quote in the book from a theologian, and ironically from the United States at Notre Dame, who said, the starting point should be building a society where life is respected and truly respected, where an unwanted pregnancy doesn't mean the end of the road for a young woman, that she needs to, drop out of school or leave her job, or, it's over, where an elderly person who is suffering, where there is proper care for them and pain management, and all the bits in between. And if we focused on that, that builds a different type of society. And ultimately, if laws are supposed to be the reflection of that society, well, then maybe at that point, we think about how we regulate these things. But everyone just rushes to point fingers and rushes, as you say, to label the other side, and not to sit down and think about what we have in common. I mean, you mentioned abortion. I always bring up with my students, and they get very upset with me, gun control. And listen, I'm a good old-fashioned liberal Canadian, and I don't understand guns at all. But at the same time, I've had to force myself, when I see the quote unquote, not on TV, some American pro-gun person who is, responding to whatever horrible situation just happened. I sometimes ask myself, does that person love his children less than me? Does that person want a shooting at a school? Does that person, and as hard as that conversation is, the fact of the matter is, I bet you they love their children as much as I love mine. They don't want shootings. They don't want tragedies, but they're seeing the world in a different way. And as tough as that is, I've got to try to maybe think about how do they see that world. That's part of our call as Catholics. And it's not something we talk about very much. We talk about a few hot button issues, and that's about it. We don't talk about this really, really big challenge to build bridges.
Catherine, if I might jump in right now. Our hour is rapidly coming to a close, and I do want to bring in some of the questions from our participants because they've been engaged in this, and I've been monitoring the Q&A, and there's some very interesting questions. So with your permission, do you mind if I jump into offering a few of those for John to respond to?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for the insightful questions. These are very tough issues, and I really appreciate your thoughts, and I appreciate, John, your humility and your frankness and the long reflection I know that you've given to these over the years, to these questions. And this kind of conversation will be going on, not just here, but in many, many other places across Canada. With a few minutes that I have left, I do want to bring up a couple questions from some of our listeners out there. By the way, we have people with us from right across Canada, virtually every province in the country. We have a number of American guests with us, and we have guests from the UK and some of the different islands in the Caribbean. So it's great to have so many people gathered here today for this discussion. But let me just jump in here with one of the questions. I know this one has come up many times in the US, and it has come up in Canada as well. So, should a priest or bishop put restrictions on Catholic politicians regarding sacrament reception in reference to their political position? What do you think?
No. Next question. Listen, the idea of weaponizing the sacraments I find it offensive. I also think of church teaching, which very much recognizes, and I'm not making, read the book. I should be promoting the book more, I guess. But I talk about, I'm not a theologian, but I do talk about some of the church teaching that talks about meeting the world where it is. And certainly there is the role of conscience. Now, conscience is not a get out of jail free card. But when you start to pull these things together, the idea of weaponizing a sacrament, the idea of a priest being in a position to tell a politician that the way they've acted is wrong. I mean, and this is in Vatican II. Vatican II says, don't look to your pastor necessarily to tell you what the right policy position is, because they're not experts in it. So, I'm very, very hesitant with the idea of using the sacrament in that way.
If I could jump in for 1 minute here. In my parish, we had a very high-profile Canadian who went to jail for white-collar crime. And when he was released, he would receive communion, and people would buzz every week, like, look at so-and-so and so-and-so, who does he think he is receiving communion? And at the very least, I thought, well, bad catechism, bad theology, nothing about the sacrament, the forgiveness aspect. You don't know whether he's been to reconciliation. It's a very judgy side of our church.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Those are both very, very fascinating answers to that. I'm gonna switch the topic here a little bit away from politicians and raise this question from one of our participants today. So Jesus reserves some of his greatest condemnation for hypocrisy. Before Catholics can credibly call for better public institutions as Catholics, should they first reform the institutional Catholic Church?
I mean, I could joke and say yes, and then move on. I think it's an ongoing process. I think the person who asked that question raises a very, very, an excellent point. We need to get our own house in order. That has to be ongoing. Again, to go back to sort of utopianism, and I don't think that's necessarily what they're saying, but are we going to sort of be perfect enough to go out and start to point fingers? We're never going to get that far. But at the same time, I think we always have to be looking inwards, and that's part of humility. And maybe that's why, the tone of the book isn't go out with guns a-blazing. It's go out to build bridges. And, so I agree with the question. We have to get our own house in order. I don't think we can wait to get our own house in order, but because we know that we're a sinful institution and that we have lots of warts, et cetera, that should give us a sense of humility. So I guess the answer to that question is both yes and no, but hopefully it will inform a sense of humility.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to ask one more question as we're rapidly running out of time. We've been at this almost an hour, and I don't want to keep people beyond the hour. But this is an interesting one. So, is it enough as Catholics to focus on progress on issues, even if the continued negative PR of Catholics and our faith remains? Can we simply be happy if the world improves in ways that align with our faith, even if people of our faith are shunned by the general public for being Catholics? Mm-hmm.
That's a wow. I remember a priest said to me once, what he said, told me a prayer that God help me to do good, but don't necessarily show me if I'm doing it, So, I mean, there's some wisdom to what they're saying. I guess it becomes a question of accountability and a question of understanding the world and the Catholic lens of seeing the world, because we want to be transparent as Catholics, and I mentioned this in the book. The idea that we're trying to impose some secret agenda, which is certainly what's often thrown at the conservatives and that sort of thing. I think we have to fight that through transparency. So, I think the questioner has a very good point that I never thought, that at the end of the day, if the poor are being fed, the hungry are being fed, and prisoners are being visited, and the stranger is being welcomed, yeah, we should celebrate that, whether the Catholic Church's mark is on that. But at the same time, to be accountable to our faith and to bring our faith to the public as Catholics, I think there has to be some transparency about it, and we have to identify, as a church, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. So perhaps you all know now why I'm a politician. I think I've answered 3 or 4 questions in a row by saying yes and no at the same time. So it's part of my training.
And you're very good at it, John. Listen, we're getting very close to our time here, and I do want to give you one last chance if there's anything you'd like to say in conclusion before we wrap up today's session.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Joe, and Novalis for your support in putting together the book. And certainly in terms of today's event, I really want to thank Catherine. It's been a wonderful conversation. And obviously all the people who've dialed in and from across. I'm very flattered from not just Canada, but from other countries. There's been lots of back and forth between Joe and I about the fact that this book has come out at the same time as the election, and obviously is hopefully feeding into a larger conversation. But I guess what I would ask is as Catholics, or not everyone watching is a Catholic, but as people of faith or people who are interested in engaging on these issues, don't let it all end on September 20th. That's one of the big problems that we have as a society is we follow the campaign, we may get involved, we vote, and then we wait until the next election comes around. A lot of what we've talked about today is going to be, not a lot, all of it is going to be as important on September 21st and forward. Being a Catholic who's engaged in the political system and engaged in the wider public policy discussion has to happen all the time. And we have to be relentless. We have to keep raising these issues and being out there pushing on them as a call of our faith. This can't simply be an election exercise. So although we'll all tune in tonight and we'll follow the campaign and we'll vote, and please vote, as of September 21st, the work continues.
Okay, John, thank you. Excellent way to end our discussion today. I want to also add my thanks to all of you who have joined us this afternoon. It's been a great afternoon. Thanks very much for Catherine for taking the time out and putting together her thoughtful questions and challenging John. And thank you, John, for sharing yourself with us this afternoon. We've had many discussions about the book and about the issue itself of the intersection of faith and politics. It's certainly been a subject that I've been sort of engaged with for most of my adult life. And I'm very honored that Novalis has been able to publish his book at this time. So that's it for this afternoon for our webinar on faith and politics. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I know you will be very engaged with the rest of this federal election campaign over the coming weeks. Take care, everyone, and goodbye.